Good evening once again. I would like to welcome you to this public debate concerning the study called Middle Class Concerns and European Challenges. This public debate is organized by the author of this study, by the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, then by the Institute for the Christian and Democratic Policy and the political think tank Topaz. Now I would like to welcome here the political director of the center, Dr. Peter Häfele, who will soon present the main study. In a while. So I have to stop you for a while. I'm also very honored to welcome here Markéta Adamová-Pekarová, and I apologize for not introducing her as the first person, as a woman. It's my fault that I first introduced a man. And next to me you can see Benjamin Chinchilla, who is head of the Department of Strategic Activities of the Czech Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. Before Peter Häfele presents the main findings of the study, I will explain why we met today. Today we have November the 16th, and you will remember that on November the 17th there was a march here that changed the life of all of us. Whether we can remember it on our own or whether we only know it from stories. This started the Velvet Revolution, and it's all the more important to realize which expectations the people had while triggering the Velvet Revolution. And now I'm handing over to the political director to present the main findings of the study. Thank you.
Mrs. Hruskova, dear Markéta, Mr. Chinchilla, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this kind invitation and great opportunity to present some of the findings, what we did last year on a large survey in all the 27 member states. But before I get into the details, I would like to thank my dear colleagues of our partner and sister foundations here in Czech Republic. It's the IKVD and Topaz. You know, the Martens Center is the official think tank of the European People's Party. That's the largest political party on the European level, and most of the parties have also party foundations. And what we are on the European level, Topaz and IKVD, are here in Czech Republic, and we're delighted. We have many events over the year, but if I'm not mistaken, it's the first time that we are here in this lovely Café Louvre. So what I'm going to present tonight is, if it's going to move, I'm sorry, that is indeed something we should not, yes. So I would like to describe a bit more what we have done over the last year. I will present the main findings of our study, and we have a special focus on the situation here in your home country. We did it in, as I mentioned, in 27 member states of the European Union, and for each of the presentations, and we're going around Europe, we have a special data set on your country to see where you stand, where your society stands, and how it is maybe different from the European level. So it's an interesting comparison you can make, better or to worse you might see. I will also draw some conclusions from a more European perspective, also from a kind of party perspective, because, well, the reason why we did it is because we think that Christian, conservative, liberal parties, their main electorate is the middle class. But what is the middle class? This is not as easy as you might thought. It's a very complex issue, and we try to dig a bit deeper into the reality of European middle classes in 2023. And then I'm very delighted, of course, to have the panel discussion, because it's not just that I present some findings we had. I'm very curious in your interpretation of the data, what it means for you, and what kind of political conclusions you might draw. And this is something where you, Markéta, for example, your party comes in to see what answers. And I had the opportunity last week to attend the party congress, and, well, some of the topics had been mentioned, and we might see what the answers might be, or at least have an idea where we should go first. Well, just to explain in a very few words what we did. So we examined what people believing that they are part of the middle class, what they think about their social position, their economic position, their perceptions, their hopes, their fears, in terms of major challenges the European Union is facing for the moment, be it economic reasons, security reasons, social dimensions. So we looked into what people think in 2023. I mentioned it's not so easy to define what middle classes are. In many countries, they use just the income and say a certain income represents middle class, but we did a bit more complex approach because it's not just what you earn. It's also very important what you think, where you are positioned in a kind of social ladder, what your expectations are, what your values are. So this is a composite definition of middle classes, and this reflects a bit better what is middle classes than just looking into the salary and the income distribution. You can imagine this very easy. You imagine a kind of ladder with from 1 to 10, and we ask people, where do you position yourselves? Sounds a bit simple, but it's not as simple, and it gives quite precise results if you compare it with other measures, but it's very easy if you have a survey. Then you have to use also tools which are very easy. The data we had acquired are from April and May this year. So this is after the Russian attack on Ukraine, which reflects in one or the other way, of course, the impact of the war in terms of security, in terms of economic situations. And as I mentioned, we went to all 27 member states. It's a representative survey. We asked more than 50,000 people. So this is something hardly done before. And even for each and every country, it's representative. What I cannot present is more precise data on different regions. For example, in Czech, though we do not have enough respondents. But for the national level, we have a representative sample across all income classes and so on. Well, what is middle class and how is it distributed? So throughout my presentation, I try to compare the European average values with the specific values of your home country. And you see, well, Czech Republic is, as major European countries, a society of middle classes. So the majority, roughly 2/3 of the people, consider themselves as being part of middle classes. You see, we differentiated. We had a upper middle class, a middle class, and a lower middle class, which is very important because much of the different values you find within the middle classes, not between the upper class or the lower class to the middle class, but it's an interesting observation. You have to look very closely into the middle classes, and that's the reason why we use classes, because this is not a homogeneous entity. This is a very complex composition, and this is a challenge in terms of political answers because their needs, their expectations are quite different in many ways. You will see later on where we show the specific results. So I start with the European average to say what, if you ask all these 50,000 European citizens, what are their expectations, their fears? Yes, and not so surprisingly, it's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of demand for security that is absolutely predominant in European citizens' mind. That's what they are most afraid of. It's economic challenges, it is housing, it's inflation, it's the future or the bad outlook for the future. And it's not only the current status which they are complaining or they are afraid of, it's also their outlook into the future. The outlook I will show you later on is not very positive. That is unfortunately a fact we have to deal with. And it is probably going to worsen. And it's not just economic uncertainties, economic fears. It's also security threats. Yes, the aggression of Russia to Ukraine has dramatically contributed, but it's not just that theater. We have a lot of other geopolitical risks and other risks such as climate change, which all contributes to a huge picture of threats around, and this is clearly reflected in our data. I mentioned the differences between the different middle classes, and what we see later on is indeed that the upper middle class and lower middle class is separated in certain ways, and all these fears I just described are very much also located in the lower middle class. They are much more affected than the other classes, and this is something which we have to politically address in any way. So before I go into details, I would like to just give you again an idea how we approach this complex phenomena, and we clustered the society in 5 different groups. This is done in most of the sociological studies these days. You don't get after the income, you get more into values, what are the aspirations, the hopes, the position of people, and we find 5 different clusters in European societies, and it's quite interesting to see how the Czech Republic is a bit different from the average of European societies. So we have a larger part in the society which we called traditionalist, people with rather conservative values, but on the other side we have also a lot of people who consider themselves as creatives, modern, progressive people, as we often say. So that is a more accentuated, I would not say polarized society, but it's interesting that it is here in your country a bit different in comparison to the European average. So back to the concerns. Let's start with what we ask, and you see a long list of issues which we ask the people to say, are you more optimistic or more pessimistic? And yes, quite clear, the biggest concern is cost of living. That is the result of high inflation, particularly after the Ukraine war, but this has started earlier, so this is not just the result of the war. And then, of course, issues such as corruption, income inequality. It's interesting that issues such as climate change or environmental issues are quite different if you look into the upper middle class and into the lower middle class. This is, again, not so surprising, I must say, because people with less income are much more concerned with economic issues, the others. But you see, would I put now the European comparison, other countries would have a different priority. If you go to Germany, for example, this issue of climate change or environmental issues would be much higher on the agenda still, even after the aggression of Russia, than here in the Czech Republic. So you see there are specific priorities in different countries which reflect, of course, the economic situation and other positions. So we had asked also, what are the major personal issues? You know, in surveys you often ask more general questions, what is happening in the society, and then you have a second set of questions where you look into the personal issues. And this is not always the same, by the way. What you think is a major concern for the society is not necessarily what your personal concerns are major. This can differentiate from your status. And you see issues of health, income, are very high ranking, and I think we tap into these issues of social security, Mr. Chinchilla, later on, because this is clearly reflected that, for example, the social security systems, the health issues are very much concerned, and in your country even higher than in most of the European countries. Others are less concerned, but yes, this is personal issues which affects each and every. If you now look into the more general perspective, what is relevant for the country as such, then yes, security, war, of course, not surprisingly, inflation, and energy. And others are not as important. They rank very similar to the other European countries, but we see that the major impacts of economic crisis and security crisis is something which is clearly defined here in your country as major concerns. So, what are the results in terms of the European level? I go to the Czech Republic immediately, but you should have an idea in which environment you are operating. What is the situation in Europe? Not surprising either, I must say, is that the issues of trust in state, in government, and unfortunately also in parties, we know it for many years, is comparatively low. The surprising issue we find it that the institutions of the European Union rank comparatively high. We have no explanation for this phenomena, because if you ask people normally, day by day, they always blame Brussels to be the bad guy. This is an interesting issue. We can later on discuss what it is. Is it more expectations than reality, or what? We have no explanation for this, but it's really outstanding in all countries. So maybe this is a good chance to do a bit more on the European level. Yes, I mentioned that lower middle classes are very much affected by the economic crisis, the inflation in particular, the housing issues, and what they expect is that security issues related to their financial situation are addressed. The upper middle classes still rank a bit different in values such as self-realization and meaning. What we find interesting, and this is an issue we can dig later on a bit, is that it's not that politics per se doesn't matter any longer. What people expect is that we have a better cooperation between different institutions, parties, civil society, government still, and the European Union. So they still believe that politics makes a difference. It's not that they think, forget politics. No, it is a better cooperation and joining those forces. And this is an interesting political message for me because there's something we can work upon. For us, being in the family of the center, right, the Christian Democratic parties, the topics we have discussed are topics of our concern and where we have a long, normally good record in this respect. So I'm more optimistic if I look through a party lens that we have a huge potential if we correctly address these challenges of security, because these are issues which are attributed to us. If you see what people think of different parties, economic competences, security issues are normally closely linked up with parties of the center-right. We have to find answers, we have to get the messages out, but basically these results, in my opinion, underline that there is a potential which we can address politically. How we do it? Yes, we discuss it, I think, later on. So let's go now into more country data. We ask in general, what are your expectations for the future? Is it getting better, getting worse? So basically, most of the majority tends to be rather a gloomy picture, but you see there is a huge difference between the lower and lower middle classes, which are very pessimistic, and those up to the upper middle classes who are more optimistic. In tendency, the Czech society is a bit more concerned about the future than the average of the European societies, and you will see it in a second a bit more. This is a bit complex, but don't worry, it's very easy to understand, because the more you go to the right side, the more the people think that politics can make a difference. That means they still believe that politics can, for example, create economic circumstances under which jobs are flourishing. They believe that the standard of living will not always degrade, but they are very much concerned about issues, for example, such as social security, income inequality, or the general situation, and also, of course, political tensions. So you have a discrepancy between some policy fields where people think the future might have some promises still, and others where they are very, very pessimistic and don't see any changes in the nearby future. Standard of living, again, here you see it's a more pessimistic outlook in terms of the Czech Republic than the European average. Then we have asked also for some very concrete policy fields, and we start, of course, being a think tank of the European People's Party. What is your future view on the European Union? Should this entity, I call it very neutral, be more integrated, or should it be more a confederation of independent states? And unfortunately, the support for the further integration of European Union is not the strongest here in your country. There are other countries that are a bit more in direction of future integration. Whatever integration means, this is something which is highly debated, but we have to acknowledge that the support for the European Union is not the highest here. It's an issue we have to work on. I've read the party program. This European integration is a major issue we have to work on, but this is, I think, underlined by the data here. So here you see a comparison in certain fields which we think make really up public opinion. The biggest concern here in Czech Republic is definitely social security and pension. Not surprisingly, when we talked about that, that's where you are currently working upon, and this is absolutely underlined by the data as well. The trust issue, well, is also a big issue of concern. The other values are more similar and not as concerned, but yes, creating a stable, secure environment is the biggest political challenges, and we can see this not only in the Czech Republic, this goes for most of the European countries as well. So, some policy fields which are of utmost concern. We start with migration. That is a big issue on all levels you can consider. And here it's clearly reflected in the data. Illegal migration is among the biggest challenges and the biggest threats seen by the Czech society, rule of law and market issues. Others, surprisingly, are of much less concern. They are a bit less in transatlantic relation, which is a big issue for us, for example, in Brussels. And, well, if it comes to values, that's not so much important. This is an issue which, for a Christian Democratic Party, for example, it's a kind of challenge because, yeah, what to do with Christian values, conservative values? Apparently, the Czech society is not very much discussing or concerned about this issue. You see, they rank absolutely on meager. But yes, migration, rule of law, economic security are the three big topics we have to deal with. So you have the same questions, and now we differentiate a bit according to different classes. And you see, there are some significant issues. Migration goes through all the different classes, but if you look into economic issues or integration issues, you see a significant difference between the upper middle class, for example, lower middle classes. The upper and middle class is more pro-European. It's not the case, unfortunately, in the lower middle classes. And, well, the value issue is apparently something which none of the classes are really concerned about. That is an issue we have to deal from a Christian perspective, indeed. So, let's get to one of the topics which are of most concerns, that's defense and security. Yeah, crisis management, migration, protecting borders, that is absolutely key, and that will play a big role, for example, also in the next European election. That is quite clear from any polls we have. Less concern is security, but still high. And I think that Czech has always been a strong supporter of the Ukrainians. For example, this is, I think, also reflected in this. And that's not surprisingly that defense, security, internally, externally, is giving also your geographic position and close to the Ukraine theater of higher concerns than with the other European countries. If you go, for example, into values in Spain or in Portugal, which are quite far away, these values are very low because they don't see it as an immediate threat. For the Czech Republic, we go to Poland or to the Baltics. Of course, it's quite understandable that these issues are very high on the priority of the people. What we ask also is about Europe, because as a European foundation, we are very much interested, how do people see Europe? And we ask, what is your impression? And we give a couple of words for them to answer. What is your perspective about the development of the European Union over the last 30 years? You have a quite wide range, which is not easy to interpret. We have issues such as freedom, which rank very high, diversity, but of course you have also disappointments, egoism is considered, but it's a more diverse picture. If you ask now, what do you expect from the European Union in the next 30 years, so looking into the future, it's a totally different picture we have. And yes, issues of stability, of safety, more solidarity are clearly marked. This is a different agenda which people see. And yes, we as politicians have to react definitely on that issue. So what are the conclusions? First, on the European level, because we have also to see what the European People's Party, for example, can answer. And in the second phase, I will show what I think can be done also on the Czech Republic. I mentioned the issue of trust in government, in state. This is something where European parties, together with our national parties, have to work upon to strengthen also the trust in the institution. This is a core issue, a core challenge for parties. What we have to manage is really to not lose further the support of the lower middle classes. I see a huge challenge that our society in the very center will fall apart, and this is essential for the stability of European societies, that we keep these people inside the society, not giving them the impression you are lost, you are out, you're not longer considered as part of the society. Yes, Europe has to do more in terms of protecting, but what we should, as conservative Christian Democrats, avoid that we get into a kind of paternalistic state, that the state should rule and regulate and protect you from each and everything. No, what we need is a new balance between social protection and market forces. We still believe that market forces in many ways are a superior force, a superior model, but we have to redefine what we call social market economy. Maybe we have underestimated the social part of the story, but not going back in Western Europe, for example, to the 1970s, the old welfare state. What we need is a new model, and this is, I think, the biggest challenge. We have to reinvent these kind of issues. In contrast to the United States, for example, where we talk a lot about the polarization and the divide in the society, European societies are not yet heavily polarized. We see among all the polls, and not only among us, that people really tend to the center. So all the fears that our societies will fall apart are not proved by any kind of statistical survey. People still expect much of the answers from centrist parties, be it center-right, center-left, but they do not prefer the extremists, both on the left as the right side. I think this is a good message because this shows that there's a potential for our parties. We have to answer. We have to take this beacon and make mouths of it. So it's not a lost case. European societies will not further polarize if the right measures are given. For Czech Republic, we have asked some specific questions. Yes, I mentioned that because the middle class is a bit larger than in many other countries. The values are the distribution among different groups, I have mentioned as well. Health, income, family life are very important, and they are a bit higher still than on the European average. This reflects a kind of traditionalist which I mentioned before. In contrast to most of the European countries, the outlook in terms of the living standard, unfortunately, is very gloomy. It's not the best. The perspectives are not seen as very optimistic, and this is a significant difference to the average in European countries. The finances and the migration are definitely, these two big topics are the major concerns which we have to address politically. Housing, among the social issues, are big, and I remember the discussions we had last week. Well, this is an issue which clearly is reflected in our data as well. The key question of further integration into Europe, and you have the debate on the euro introduction, for example, remains a big political challenge. It's an uphill battle because, unfortunately, the mood in the Czech society is not so much towards further integration. That remains for parties such as us, who are very pro-European, a big challenge to address. And then energy security, and that is something which is not surprising for you, is of highest issues. The answers are different, but I think every society and every country is struggling very much to find solutions. Your big neighbor has other problems, but he caused us a lot of problems. So energy security is among the issues, and it's so closely related to issues of inflation, for example, and security. That is one of the core pieces we have. So with this, I would like to close my presentation. You find all the more detailed information in our study. I hope you have already taken some of the copies. I'm very willing to share this information later on through our partners, then you can read a bit more into the specific data. I would again thank you very much for your attention. I hope we have now laid the foundation for an interesting discussion, also looking what it means politically. How do we as politicians or political foundations react to these findings? Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Peter Häferland before we start our discussion with our distinguished guests. I would like to ask you for the following. If you have any question, if you would like to ask anything, you can interrupt us anytime during the discussion. And now I would like to ask the Madam Chair for your first reaction. We have a larger middle class, and the Czech middle class has more concerns than any others in Europe. Once again, thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really very pleased that we have the chance to get such an update on a regular basis, and I would like to thank Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies and Peter Häfele for giving us these insights, and we can use this as food for thought for the discussion. I think that the findings are not that surprising because those of us who know what is going on around us cannot be surprised by the finding. We know what's going on a couple of 100 kilometers away from us, what's going on there. And we have to some degree become tired already of the situation, and we may have the feeling that this will last longer, several years to follow. And we are now simply perceiving the consequences of the conflict that is taking place several hundred kilometers away from us. We experienced the COVID pandemic lasting about 2 years, and this pandemic brought about a lot of uncertainty, and it also had an impact on the society. The COVID pandemic is now also reflected in our low trust in the institutions. The survey has shown that the trust in the institutions has rather decreased. And after the pandemic, we suddenly experienced a true energy crisis because one energy supplier went out of business, and this affected 1 million people. And then the war broke out in the Ukraine, which affected everybody. With the war in the Ukraine, many challenges emerged. You know that at the beginning there was a huge wave of solidarity. At the beginning, like during the pandemic, but this solidarity does not last forever. I can remember February 2022 when Putin attacked the Ukraine. I can remember that we had a large number of public meetings 1 or 2 weeks after the war broke out, and I told the people, so please remember the emotions you are now experiencing, because in a couple of weeks, months or years they will be worth remembering, because the emotions will one day also disappear. That is a natural approach, but unfortunately the consequences will not disappear, and they pose major challenges to us, and we simply cannot lie to each other. We cannot pretend not to be affected by what is going on in the Ukraine. It simply is felt by everybody, by the middle class as well. So that is why I think that the data is really nicely reflecting what is going around, what is happening around. Now I would like to ask the representative of the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs to tell us how you are perceiving this also with regard to social benefits. I wanted to follow up on Madam Chair because the welfare system and benefits have been a topic that we have been dealing with since the start of the war. That is when I assumed my office in the ministry. The first task we were entrusted with was elaborating on a map of people who are vulnerable, so that we know which group of the people is affected most by the crisis, by the energy crisis, due to the fact that one utility went out of business, and also as a consequence of the Russian aggression in the Ukraine. We found that the senior citizens pose a major vulnerable group, especially those living alone, and then also people sustaining a child on their own, sole parents, and also families with multiple children are suffering out of proportion as well. We wanted to realize at whom we are targeting our welfare benefits. And the senior citizens as a consequence of the previous political governments, did not suffer that much because the former legislation allowed for indexing every single year as a consequence of the inflation. However, families with several children and sole parents were suffering, and that is why we increased the subsistence allowance several times in order to help specific people in need who might fall below the poverty line otherwise. And we also dramatically modified the housing allowance, especially for those people who got into a difficult situation as a consequence of the inflation of high energy heating costs. And when I compare the situation between 2022 and the year after, in 2022 the housing allowance amounted to approximately 6 billion Czech crowns. However, in the first 10 months of this year, it was increased by 8.5 billion Czech crowns. It is really targeted welfare assistance. However, we must always realize that Czechia has a high public deficit, and the fact that we are targeting at specific groups of population is quite reasonable, especially regarding the fact that the debts will cause troubles to the generations to follow. Today, we simply have to pay high interest in order to pay down the public deficit. For example, 34% of the public spending is on the senior citizens, and I think that the interest of the debt is ranking on 7th place of the amount that of the expenditure. That is why some quick solutions like one-off subsidies for families were granted. We did not want to buy our voters with this one-off benefit, but we did not want to increase the mandatory spending in the long run. I think I could present more figures. I like fiddling with figures. Oh, thank you. You have given me a good chance to ask the next question, because one of the major concerns mentioned here was the future, the social security and the future of the middle class. The Minister Jurečka presented the pension reform yesterday, and if I say it briefly, it will increase the retirement age, and it will also decrease the amount you receive as a senior citizen. How do you see the combination of the old age retirement system and the social welfare, the social security? Madam Chair, I think we must consider what is still acceptable for the society as such. You know that in the past 30 years there has been one attempt at a true pension system reform. However, the government which assumed office afterwards did not modify it. It simply cancelled it completely, terminated the validity of the then pension scheme reform. Unfortunately, we must take lessons, learn lessons from this, because then the discussion about the pension system was off the table for many years, off the agenda, despite the fact that the politicians knew that it was a necessity. The lesson learned is that most people want the measures to be taken, but they do not want to be affected by it. Well, the people will say in the survey, of course I wish for a pension scheme reform, but when you ask them about the details, for example about the retirement age, then the people will say, no, I'm opposed to that. So the steps cannot simply be taken without affecting the people. This is what we can agree on. And at the same time, it is not possible to design a system that will fit everybody. And when we will say, okay, this is perfect, this fits us all, it will always be criticized. And I also understand that it attracts the attention of the media. On the other hand, we know the proverbs, the sayings like you should probably find the helping hand somewhere else. I think for us, the center and right politicians, this is really quite difficult. The survey suggested one important piece of information. What I liked is that the middle class people do not want a paternalistic government. The people do not want the government to take care of the people and to lead them to guide them by the hand. The people want to enjoy freedom, and at the same time they want to take care of themselves. The people still expect the government to create good conditions and to provide for security. This is a task of the government. We can't provide for the security on our own. And our government has also been significantly investing in the security, especially with regard to what is going on in the world. And the social security is also necessary for those people who cannot save enough money for the old age. And also the welfare benefit system must be reformed because the current system would not be sustainable, and it is not easy. It is not transparent either, because it also creates a lot of opportunity for abuses. I do not want to say that the social security system would be abused dramatically. That's a cliche only. It is not confirmed by data. However, we must make the system well arranged, transparent and easy to follow. And let us admit that we will be affected by it simply, and there is no way around it. And we cannot have a low retirement age and a high pension at the same time. This excludes the...
Dr. Haferle, would you like to respond?
Also on the competitiveness, because value creation is the basis of all redistribution. I think this is often forgotten also on the European level. They are more dealing with distributing resources. The debt issue you mentioned is the biggest issue, which nobody really touches. We have stockpiled many trillions already, if you count all these measures together, and nobody has an idea who one can pay back this once on the European level, neither on the national level. So this is the big hidden, no, not so hidden problem, which we have to address as a conservative Christian Democratic Party, because this is a responsibility we share. We cannot leave it to our children or grandchildren, because this system will not persist.
I'll be happy to follow up on that. Today, and it's not spoken about so much in the media, we have very low unemployment, and in the productive age we have baby boomers. So these are ideal conditions for earning money, for being in a surplus. But currently we have a deficit of -1% of GDP. So we can discuss whether we should have a reform or large parametric changes, but it's time to really do something. If we fail to do something, then after 2030, the people who will get retired are the current baby boomers. And then we will be increasing the deficit to -5% of GDP, which means minus 350 billion Czech crowns. But the population is not only getting older, but in the healthcare system, the deficit is increasing by 1% every year. These are hard data from the Ministry of Healthcare. And this all contributes to a situation in which we really need to adopt a reform. And Speaker, I think that you approved modifications of the third pillar of the social system. I think that it is still not sufficient, but in spite of that, we support people in saving money from early age. They should save money from the very start, and there will be a slight reduction of pensions starting from 2026, and the state will more and more support private savings in the supplementary pension scheme. I would like to add one more thing. It's very important, and I will follow up on what the previous speaker has said. Unfortunately, in the Czech Republic, we can see a trend in which people think that the services provided, for example, in healthcare are completely free of charge. Of course not. They pay for that by taxes and contributions. But we have a really good level of healthcare compared to other countries, and we have high availability of such care. And the same goes for other systems. Education as well as healthcare are areas in which only a minimum contribution is required from the population, and this is not a standard in other European countries. The data also show that our elderly people, unlike others, do not pay anything from their pensions. So the pensions are their net income. In our country, 95% of people receiving pensions only depend on the state pensions. They have no other source of money. And compared to Western countries of the European Union, this is not a standard. It's a very high number. And there are a lot of complex factors that combine here. But when we have a comparison with other countries, we can have a look at the individual factors and compare the situation. But what you can usually compare is the overall setting of the systems. For example, if you compare the German and the Czech senior citizens, and if you imagine what they have to pay extra from their income, this is the complex picture that we should consider. There are social services, healthcare services. You should look at the availability of this care, at the availability of other sources of income, and so on. And I think that this is what may be bottleneck of the international studies, something that we may tend to forget. And this is one of the generosities of our system. The system is very robust. You mentioned the comparisons. And the study also showed that our middle class is more traditionalist. And it shows that there are not many creatives and there are not enough people who would like to pursue their own business. How can we change policies so that the people can say that we are not just an industrial country, low-income country? We keep complaining about that, but because of the foreign investors, we also have very low unemployment rate. Mrs. Pekarová-Adamová. Well, that has been a nice description. We will fail to change it if we do not discuss all of these things. We need to describe them in context, and we must be very transparent and mention the context. Even us, the politicians, have a tendency to look at the Czech Republic as an assembly plant, but this is no longer the case. We have a lot of startups and innovative companies active in very promising areas, and they produce things that are the top from the European and international perspective. But we fail to find the right path forward. We should say this is the key area, so let's use this as a basis and further develop this. In our pockets, we have something that we couldn't never imagine some 30 years ago. For example, I learned the program T602 at school. These were basic computers it was impossible to do almost anything on these computers. But we adopt all these technology changes very positively. And these are leaps that play a role in our lives. But we gradually adapt to all of these changes, and you would not go and buy a smartphone without all the functions, although you just use 10% of the available functions. And I'm saying this as an example because many areas, many industries are developing very fast. And the Czech Republic is outstanding in many of them, and we are not saying this in our public discussions. When I traveled to Taiwan in spring this year, and there were many companies, more than 100 of them traveling with me, and I asked them about what they were doing, and they are active in artificial intelligence, science, and I even had to ask them what it actually meant, what they were working on specifically. And these companies are in the high-tech area, and they are competitive from the international perspective. And this is something that we can further develop. Okay, we have great guests. Mr. Häfele, would you like to respond?
Not as pessimistic if it comes to the countries in Central and Eastern Europe. I'm more concerned about the big engines we had so far, for example, Germany or France. I'm much more pessimistic in terms of their capability to reform. Yes, you are very closely linked to their national economies, and you suffer to some extent from their weakness in growth, for example. But I think things are shifting, and it's rather the old engines, as I mentioned, who have to be very careful that you're not running off and creating new networks. I think the economic geography in Europe will change with the transformation of the economies, and I think you have good positions and starting points. I'm less pessimistic. It is a hard time of this transformation, but I'm more concerned about the traditional big fishes in the European pond.
To be able to transform economy, we have to ensure that the labor market is flourishing, and for this we need immigration of foreign nationals. I don't mean only manual workers, but we should try to attract also highly skilled people that could work in the area of innovations and new technologies. This would allow us to produce more and more added value products. But as Markéta Pekarová-Adamová said, it's not true what you can read sometimes in the media. We are not an assembly line. We are a country of innovations. But within education, within the PhD programs, we need to support this more. And for example, the PhD study reform is something that we really need. We need to create good conditions for our PhD students. We need to be innovative. And the second thing that relates to the labor market are wages. We don't have good conditions on the labor market. There is no potential for the increase of wages. We talk a lot about the increase of the minimum wage, but the minimum wage is related to other 7 important parameters, and this is dependent on the discussion with labor unions as well. Some of the industries in the Czech Republic are very different, and what will help flexibility of the labor market is a reform of the current system that we have in the Czech Republic. Well, I slightly disagree with one thing. I think that if you have low unemployment, you can ask for an increase in wage, or you can leave to a different company. But that's probably our national character. We are unable to ask for more money. And we don't know how to fight for this. We are unable to say, okay, we are wanted on the labor market. And there is another source. The source are the foreign workers, and there is a quota of 20,000 foreign workers. This quota was defined by the government together with the Chamber of Commerce, and the question is that who is coming to the Czech Republic should be assessed from the security point of view. This slows down the process, and we are trying to speed the process up. But this government is aware of that, and we are doing as much as possible. And what is also important are people caring about their family members, and they should have the opportunity to combine a family life and work. Especially those who care of little kids should have the opportunity of part-time contracts. Our government made preference or supported more these part-time contracts, part-time employment. And there were a number of jobs that were created, and we could see outstanding figures already during the first year after these changes. Of course, this presents a lot of requirements for the availability of care, for example, kindergartens, children groups, and we are preparing new changes. For example, we provide support to children's groups. These are very small groups of 4 children. And it is the Austrian and German model Tagesmutter. This form of upbringing is not well defined by the rules. These may be tiny details, but they are important from the perspective of the context. We want to make care of children more available. We have a 4-year maternity leave or parental leave, and this is not standard from the international perspective, and it's a quite a long time. And we want people to have more and more children, and if they have a 4-year parental leave, it's harder for them to come back to the working life. A high share of mothers, especially, need to start a business. Sometimes they are self-employed or freelancers, but these are very often just emergency solutions. This is not that they really want. It's just an emergency solution of their family conditions. So this is a huge potential for us.
You talked here about the 20,000 foreign workers. Now, I would also like to say the following. When the war broke out in the Ukraine, approximately 200,000 refugees came, and about 100,000 of them found a job in Czechia. The political representation and Czechia really did a great job and took the right attitude, and the people just found jobs here, and they did not take the job away from anybody else, especially when you consider the long-term low unemployment rate. So could we give them long-term jobs, but consider the visa? I think we granted them the refugee status. I can't remember the right name, but they simply were granted the asylum. 550,000 of them, and 350,000 of them are still in Czechia, but not all of them are in the productive age. So it includes children and senior citizens as well. So 115,000 or 120,000 of them are now working. So it is approximately 50% of the population of the adult population. So it's more than elsewhere in other countries, and the employers often ask us what will happen when the people return back to the Ukraine, because they have a shortage of staff now and the shortage will contract in the future as well. So on the one hand, it's in our interest to keep the people here, but on the other hand, the Ukraine needs them in order to restore the country. And the longer the conflict lasts, then it's quite evident and clear from worldwide experience that the people will stay. So the people will settle down here, and then their families will rather follow them and come to Czechia. So it will not be the other way around. It will rather depend on the development of the situation in the Ukraine. Unfortunately, there is no end to the war in sight at this moment. So it sounds like it's cynical to say that it's our interest to retain the people here in our country. So the language proximity is also very important for the integration, but I think that they are being integrated well into the society. And you are right that we simply calculate with this number of Ukrainian workers in this country. On the other hand, we must realize that the country needs them back, and we also need the Ukraine to restore and recover again. And we should also consider this as an interest as well, because there is also a flip side to this coin. Mr. Häfele.
Well, if we leave the Ukrainian case outside, which has special characteristics, the interesting question is the European migration policy. And so far, it has quite failed, to put it quite bluntly, because we get people which do not contribute to a large extent to the future growth, even in the next generation. We have not dared to put these brutal facts on the table. We have a completely uncontrolled migration to a large extent. It's not focusing on our needs. That is a legitimate reason for migration, to select people. It sounds a bit harsh, but other nations do it for decades or even centuries. And if we do not manage to make major progress, and you have seen the data that migration, illegal migration, is the biggest concern, if we cannot manage to integrate them very fast into our value creation, that's the economic issue we are talking about, we will neither fulfill the needs of our labor markets, which are dramatically changing, not only in the low qualified levels, but in particular in the higher qualified, nor will we have a sustainable social network, because we need net contributors, not just people taking money out. But this is not openly addressed. It's highly ideologically poisoned, this debate, so we make no progress. This is an issue which cannot be solved only on the national level. This is an issue Europe has to. We are slowly making some progress, but we're far away from any kind of convincing solution which serves our needs as well. This is legitimate. It's not just about human protection, which is pretty fine. We do a lot, but we have the right also to define our interests, what we need.
So I would like to ask you if we are able to define the interest of Czechia in the EU, at least in this respect. I think it's important to realize what Peter said. We must address this issue together. There is no local solution at the national level. That's quite clear. The migration pact is the right way, the right path that might help significantly. We have seen very little progress in the past few years, especially since the main migration wave in 2015, and now this is the best step on which the 27 member states were able to agree on. However, we must also be prepared for the migration wave from Africa due to the climate change, and this will be increasingly dangerous, and this may pose a challenge to Europe, and it may also shatter the trust in political institutions and in democracy, because democratic politicians will be facing major risks, because the extremists will be flourishing as a consequence of this, and the discussion must be led at a reasonable, rational level without emotions, and we must always point to a joint solution. We can't address the problem without the rest of Europe. Malta, Portugal, Greece cannot address it on its own either. We have a question from the auditorians. Please speak into the microphone. We heard here a very detailed analysis, and also the current situation was evaluated and analyzed here. But I was missing a future vision. How shall we address it? We are heavily indebted. We are stagnating. We've been in a recession. We must increase the income. We must kickstart the economy. We must do something in order to increase the spending, and unfortunately Europe is not able to address it now on its own. Europe must now turn to the capital. It must attract very interesting businesses and invite them to Europe, and at this moment I can now see that this is now in East Asia, like Korea, Japan, Taiwan, etc. So I would like to ask you about your opinion. We must encourage the people because we are stagnating and we are calling each other bad names. We keep complaining, but we must also have a future vision. Ms. Pekarová. I see it exactly the same way as you have outlined that. I think we should take those steps in order to attract here, especially highly qualified people, not only manual laborers or people with low skills. We should more focus on well-qualified people. The government has really a big backlog because there is a lot of improvement here, because the processes are extremely lengthy. And we must also change the pace at which we are working, otherwise we will not be able to address this problem. It's within the remit of the Ministry of the Interior. So it's the Ministry of the Interior is now having a good control of the security, but unfortunately there is very little flexibility here. I know that an amendment is now in the making which would alleviate the situation. So, for example, now if you have been here for 2 years integrated in the labor market, then unfortunately you must undergo the same procedure as 2 years ago, despite the fact that Czechia has made some experience with the person, and despite the fact that the person has been a trouble-free person respecting the law in Czechia. And then we simply create extra burden for the civil servants. These people are now undergoing the same process. So I think that we should really only focus on those newcomers, on new entrants on the job market. Another issue is also applying for the visa if you are a relative or a family member. So just imagine you are an IT worker coming from India. This is a frequent example. If you are an IT specialist coming from India, then you also want to come with your family here, but then the person will rather give priority to Poland, where the process is handled much faster than in Czechia. It's also an issue of the weak points that have been identified. Another weak point is also the speed, or rather a low pace of administrative procedures in Czechia, albeit, for example, building permits, which are very important for the development of this country. We amended the Act on line construction or line structures. It should make sure that within 1 year the whole process can be completed when it comes to some major infrastructure assets like railway, main roads, power plants, etc. But there are many more problems ahead of us. Let us be on it. The public administration is one of the major barriers to the growth. If I may add a brief note regarding how we might progress in the future. It was said here that we have really tight hands, so we must undertake reforms. Madam Chair talked here about the labor market, or for example the housing, but also the social services must also have a future vision. A major reform must be undertaken. When it comes to the welfare benefits, there is still a lot for improvement here, because a lot of people are in the so-called grey market. 2 weeks ago I saw an analysis presented by Visa. The grey market is one of the worst in Czechia, in the whole of Europe. So, for example, if we got to the level of Austria, we would have another 500 billion Czech crowns in the official budget of the government. So we would have an extra income. So we must simply make sure that the money is not lost. Do not make the system complicated for the businessmen. We mustn't encourage the businessmen to siphon the money off the official political system. This would also help us. We mustn't be afraid of reforms.
Well, if we assume that 80% of the regulations are Brussels-made to some extent and immediately effective in national law, that's where the biggest fight is, and it got not better in recent years. If you see what's still up to be decided in the upcoming months till the end of legislation, it's still hundreds of very complex issues with a lot of regulations. So for our political family, I think the next legislation in Europe is about reducing and not just promising to reduce, but do it de facto. A second point to you, sir, you mentioned other nations, other regions. We often tend to say, oh, look to the United States, look to East Asia, and sometimes trying to copy that model of growth. That will never work. I lived many years in Asia and the US. We have our specific European ecosystems, and we have to look into our strengths. There is still, European economics history is quite successful in many ways. We have to look back what made us strong in the last century, and this is not the American model or the Asian model, which has very specific preconditions. So look rather to your own strengths and unleash that potential than trying to follow a model which will never work in Europe.
Thank you. Next question from the public. Hello. We mentioned the future of Czechia compared to the EU. And I think that the priority should be education. What is the position of the government to the amendment of law on universities? I'm not a real expert on this area, and I don't want to pretend that I am an expert, but Minister Langšádlová prepared an amendment of the law on innovations and science, and that's a major part of the life of students and PhD students. And I agree that PhD studies need to be adapted to practice in the Czech Republic. For many people, PhD studies do not have any perspective, and we need to attract talents, we need to support them. This amendment that is being proposed does not only apply to universities, obviously, but the purpose of this amendment is to reduce the bureaucratic burden, the administrative burden, to redefine the priorities as well. Because in a moment where you concentrate on 70 different things, everything is complicated. You can't have more than 5 priorities. You cannot have 70 priorities. And they should focus on the most burning issues, such as climate change, and adaptation to climate change and the transformation of economy, which is related to that. And the last thing I would like to mention, and that's my impression from the debate on universities in the Czech Republic. On the one hand, we have high autonomy, which is great, but on the other hand, we can see that universities are unable to develop further. Oh, and it's not only about money. It's also about the investment of money. Efficiency of money and investments is very important. And we need to perform many checks in this respect. Otherwise, we cannot develop any further. My impression is that there are many burning issues because the system is opposed to major changes to a higher level of control, but without that we cannot develop. We have another question from the audience. No, the lady was first. Okay. Good evening. I'll be brief. I am against what you have said. I have a question to Mr. Häfele. If I've understood correctly, 85% of people are concerned of immigrants or exile, and only 15% people are concerned about the Christian values. And then I have a question to Mr. Chinchilla. You told us that the system works, but it doesn't work. I'm a social worker. And you need to wait for 9 months or 1 year for a allowance for care. And this is essential for the people. If it's a housing allowance, then I think that most people had to wait for 9 months to receive the benefit. That's not ideal at all. You also mentioned grey economy, but we should admit that the country produces grey economy. We should be aware that 10% of people are heading towards seizure of property or foreclosure. And these people will obviously end up in a black market. That means that there will be no taxes received. And I have a final question to Mrs. Pekarová-Adamová. What is a great issue here in the Czech Republic is that what really unites the government coalition is the fight against Mr. Babiš, the donut producer. I think that you should have said at the very beginning that we need to increase the income. It's obvious that without that it's not possible. But most people expected that you would say that. You know, I work in the social care area, so I suppose that you will increase taxes. That's obvious. But we kept using our budget for 10 years. But this step was never mentioned. And I think that government failed to communicate what you focus on, and it failed to communicate with the ordinary people. You are unable to communicate with them. Thank you. So, first of all, Mr. Häfele.
Just in terms of the numbers, well, it was mainly illegal migration, which was a major concern. Regulated, serving more to the purposes of domestic industry is widely accepted among European societies. It's the uncontrolled influx of migration and the following problems, which are of major concerns. This question about Christian value, it is just reflecting the reality that it is not longer a very determining factor in political decisions any longer. This doesn't say that societies do not accept or appreciate these kind of values, but they simply do not matter any longer in comparison to other factors if it comes to decision making. This is just related to what should be done in politics, what should be considered. And this is quite clear. And this goes, by the way, for all European societies, even for what we consider very traditionalist countries. If you look to Poland, to an neighboring country, it's slightly higher, but even below 25%. So we have to face that European reality has come to an issue of highly secularized societies.
Mr. Chinchilla? Well, it's not my style to make objections, but I admit that you have to wait for quite a long time for the allowances, but we had the Ukrainian crisis and the labor offices were overwhelmed by applicants. And it's true that there has been no major change for many years. We are also struggling with digitization, and at most labor offices this was not really welcome. There were some issues with the payment of benefits or pensions, but it's our aim to improve the situation very fast. I admit that the situation is not ideal. That's why we are working on digitization. We want to make it simpler for all the people. We don't want to stand them in queues at labor offices. And we want the state not to ask them about the information that it can get from other sources. So we want to make it more efficient. And you also mentioned the black market. It is true that the state contributes to the creation of the black market. It's not black market, we call it the Schwarz system. This exists mainly in the area of businessmen, entrepreneurs, and if you are if you are an electrician, then you have to submit the information about your costs, and all of this is quite complicated. And we need to change these things during this term or probably the next term, because this is an area where we are losing quite a lot of money and it is not a just system. I received a question or maybe a comment that we are united only in our fight against Mr. Babiš, the donut producer. Okay, so let's call him donut producer. What does he represent? He represents a certain style of operation, I would say, or perhaps a lack of values. Or he represents a certain type of approaches. And we are united because we dislike these approaches. And we are united because we are used to work completely in a different style. We know that after today, there will be some tomorrow, that everything needs to be considered in a context. We should not only focus on our own benefits, and we know that we will have to contribute to benefits also in future. It should not be just a benefit for our own companies. What matters to us are completely different values and a vision for the future. When we won the elections and when we formed the coalition subsequently, we promised that we wouldn't be here only for our own voters, but for the entire society. And I think that we are proving this. We are talking about the middle class, but we should also not forget about the others who do not belong to middle class. I'm not speaking now about the upper class, obviously. And we can't forget that we should ensure prosperity also for lower class. And the social system ensures this. The middle class may object that we have made the social system stronger, but I think that in this situation, in the current conditions affected by all of the crises, it was impossible to act differently, because you cannot just say that the people will get bankrupt, and because it would have wide social impacts. You also said that we should admit that we are increasing taxes, that we are ensuring consolidation of public finances. This is true. It's not only about the increase in tax, but also about modification of VAT. For some items, the VAT will be reduced, and this impact may be positive for households and society as a whole. But there have been also some increased payments for the self-employed people. When designing the consolidation package, we try to ensure that the burden is put on everyone. We didn't want to select just three groups, three categories of population. And we made steps, especially in the pension system, and this should ensure savings for the future. And it's very hard to explain these steps. And for the opposition, it's very easy to criticize, but these steps were fundamental. Thank you. Unfortunately, our time is almost up, but we have space for one last question. I'll be very brief, as usual. I will remain sitting, if you allow me. I have heard very poor communication. You mentioned the financial benefits. You mentioned that finally you prepared conditions for the mothers, for teachers. We do have an educational system. Jan Amos Comenius said that school should be a game. So why don't little kids learn enough? That's our future, or your future. Why aren't they taught how to communicate? Why aren't they taught about the decision-making process? Our education is still based on the Austrian-Hungarian drill. Yes, we have softened the system a little bit, but I would propose that what is controlled by the state changes the methods. We should change it to the standard that is usual in the European Union. It would cost nothing, just goodwill. I would like to comment on this. In the education system, we tend to repeat clichés, like the one with the assembly line. I think that this is no longer the case. Yes, there are major differences among schools. There may be some regional differences. But we can see major improvement. We have made progress. So it's not only about frontal education. Children don't need to memorize things anymore. There is a high variability in schools. It's also up to the management to decide about the educational style. And we have had a large debate about the schooling system, especially because of the strike that is being prepared. And schools should have enough funds to modernize the schooling system. They should be able to give more lessons to the groups that really need it, and so on. And a few words to the study that has been presented. It is my impression that what is missing in the Czech Republic is trust to institutions, trust to the government. And we think that there is not enough continuity in certain things. But, for example, as regards education, we follow up on the good steps of previous government, which is the Strategy 2030. And the purpose of this strategy and its aim until 2030 is to strengthen the competences within the schooling system. not the knowledge. That means also the presentation skills, the communication skills, critical thinking, all of these things. That's included in the strategy. You also mentioned communication in general. I'm aware that we have a large space for improvement here, and it's not only Top 09 that is aware of that. I think that all of the political parties are aware of that, and we are working on this. These words have been very nice as a conclusion. You mentioned the children. They are really our future. Let me thank Speaker of the Chamber of the Deputies of the Parliament of the Czech Republic, Markéta Pekarová-Adamová. Thank you and goodbye. And enjoy the national holiday tomorrow. I'm very glad that we could hear a presentation by Peter Heffele, Policy Director of the Martens Center from Brussels. Thank you very much. And we also listened to the perspective of the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs. It was presented by Head of Department of Strategic Activities, Benjamin Chinchilla. Thank you. And I would also like to say that the organization of this event was ensured by the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies from Brussels, Institute of Christian Democratic Politics, as well as the Political Institute TOPAS. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.